Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness change everything forever. When 63-year-old rancher Buck Hartley offered water to an exhausted elderly woman traveling through the harsh desert, he thought nothing of it, just doing the decent thing any man would. He gave her his last apple, patched her shoe, and let her rest in his barn. But the next morning, Buck heard something that stopped him cold: the thunder of hundreds of hooves. 300 mounted warriors had arrived at his ranch, silent and watchful, circling his property. The woman he'd helped wasn't just a traveler, she was a revered elder of a powerful indigenous nation. What happens when one man's simple act of compassion rewrites decades of buried history? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Buck Hartley rose with the sun, as he had for more than 40 years. At 63, his body knew the routine better than his mind did. 5:30 in the morning, the Arizona sky still holding onto the purple-gray of night, and already he could feel the promise of another scorcher building in the air. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, bare feet on the cool wooden floor, and reached for the pocket watch on his nightstand. The watch had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. Silver, tarnished now despite Buck's occasional attempts to polish it, with an inscription on the back that he could recite from memory. Time heals, but honor endures. His grandfather had carried it through the roughest years of the territory, back when the boundaries between ranchers and the indigenous peoples were still being drawn in blood and broken promises. Buck turned it over in his calloused palm, feeling its familiar weight, then set it back down. Some mornings he wondered what the old man would think of how things had turned out. The ranch house was small, built in 1947 by Buck's father when he came back from the war. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that opened into a living room, a bathroom added in the 60s. Sarah had always wanted to expand it, add a proper dining room, maybe a sunroom where she could grow herbs year-round. But there'd never been enough money, and then there'd been the cancer. And now Buck lived alone in rooms that felt too big and too small at the same time. He made coffee the old way, in a dented percolator on the gas stove, and drank it black while standing at the kitchen window. Beyond the dusty glass, his land stretched out in every direction. 800 acres of stubborn earth, half of it barely suitable for grazing. The Sonoran Desert didn't give up its secrets easy, and it sure didn't make ranching simple. Mesquite and Palo Verde trees dotted the landscape, their shadows long in the early light. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels, some of them older than the ranch itself. The land had a savage beauty to it, the kind that could break your heart and make you grateful in the same breath. Buck pulled on his boots, worn leather, resoled twice, and his hat, a sweat-stained Stetson that Sarah had bought him for his 50th birthday. He stepped out onto the porch and took a deep breath. The morning air was cool, but it wouldn't last. By noon, the temperature would climb past 100 degrees. The drought had been going on for 3 years now, the longest dry spell Buck could remember. His stock tank was down to 1/3, and the spring that fed it was barely a trickle. His truck, a 1998 Ford that had seen better decades, sat in the dirt yard next to the barn. Buck walked past it toward the corrals, where his 3 horses stood waiting. They were old, like him. Dusty, a buckskin gelding, was 22. Copper, the sorrel mare, was 19, and Red, the youngest at 15, had arthritis in his back legs that made him move careful and slow. Buck couldn't bring himself to put any of them down, even though keeping them fed was getting harder each year. He checked their water troughs, filled them from the hose connected to his well. The well was holding steady, thank God, but he worried about it every day. If it went dry, he'd be finished. He scooped grain into their buckets and watched them eat, their teeth grinding, their tails swishing at flies. There was something peaceful about it, something that connected him to every morning that had come before. After the horses were fed, Buck walked the fence line on the eastern boundary. It was a routine he kept religiously. The fence was old, patched in 100 places, and he couldn't afford to replace it. Corporate ranchers had been circling for years, offering to buy him out. Sinclair Agricultural Group had made 3 offers in the last 2 years alone, each one higher than the last. But Buck wasn't interested. This land had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had fought for it. His father had sweated for it, and Buck had buried his wife on it, up on the hill beneath a cottonwood tree where she could see the sunsets she'd loved. The fence was holding, mostly. A few wires needed tightening, one post needed to be reset, but it would last another season. Buck made mental notes as he walked, his eyes scanning the ground for tracks. Javelinas sometimes rooted under the fence, and coyotes were always a problem. Once, years ago, he'd found mountain lion tracks near the spring. That had been something to see. By the time he made it back to the house, the sun was fully up and the heat was building. Buck went inside, made himself 2 eggs and some toast, and ate at the kitchen table while reading yesterday's newspaper. He was 2 days behind on the news, but it didn't matter much. The world kept turning whether he kept up with it or not. His daughter Emily had called 3 days ago from Phoenix. She was a lawyer now, busy with cases, and a husband Buck had met twice. She meant well, checking in on him, but there was always a distance in her voice, like she was calling from another planet instead of just 2 hours away. His son, Michael, was somewhere in Colorado working construction. Buck hadn't heard from him in 4 months. The boy had never taken to the ranch, had left the day after high school graduation, and barely looked back. Buck washed his dishes, dried them, put them away. Sarah had kept the kitchen organized with a precision that bordered on military, and he tried to honor that. Every pot had its place, every cup its hook. Sometimes he'd reach for something and remember her hands there, remember her humming while she cooked, remember the way she'd look at him over her coffee cup in the morning, with those eyes that saw right through to his bones. He spent the afternoon mending tack in the barn. The leather was dry, cracking in places, and he worked saddle soap into it with patient, circular motions. His hands were steady, despite his age, still strong from a lifetime of work. The barn was dim and cool, smelling of hay and horse and old wood. Barn swallows nested in the rafters, darting in and out through the open doors. Buck found the work meditative, the kind of thing that let his mind wander without getting lost. Around 4 o'clock, he drove into town, a 20-minute trip on washboard roads that rattled every bolt in the truck. Tres Piedras wasn't much, just a wide spot in the road with a post office, a feed store, a diner, and a gas station. Buck stopped at the feed store first, where Hank Richardson stood behind the counter like he'd been standing there since the Roosevelt administration. Hank was 71, rail-thin, with a face like jerky and a mind sharp as barbed wire. "Buck," Hank said, nodding. "Hank, how's the water situation?" "Holding," Buck said. "For now." "Sinclair's been asking about you again," Buck grunted. "They can keep asking. Heard they're offering top dollar. Twice. What the land's worth. Then they can pay it to someone else." Hank smiled, a thin crack in his weathered face. "Stubborn as your daddy. That a compliment? Take it however you want." Buck bought 50 pounds of grain and a salt lick, loaded them in the truck bed, and drove across the street to the diner. Inside, the air conditioning was a blessed relief. He took his usual booth by the window and ordered coffee and a slice of apple pie from Maria, who'd been waitressing there for 30 years. "You eating enough, Buck?" she asked, concern in her dark eyes. "I'm fine, Maria. You're getting skinny." "I'm 63. I'm supposed to be skinny." She shook her head and brought him the pie with a scoop of vanilla ice cream he hadn't ordered. Buck ate slowly, watching the street outside. A few cars passed, heat shimmering off their hoods. Old Julio Martinez, the retired veterinarian, walked by with his dog, raising a hand in greeting. Buck raised his coffee cup in return. Doc Martinez had been a good friend to Sarah during her last months. He'd sit with her on the porch, tell her stories about his travels in Mexico, make her laugh, even when the pain was bad. Buck owed him more than he could ever repay, but Doc always waved it off. "That's what neighbors do," he'd say. It was an old-fashioned sentiment, but then again, they were old-fashioned people. By the time Buck drove home, the sun was sinking toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He parked the truck, unloaded the grain, and fed the horses their evening meal. Then he walked up to the cottonwood tree on the hill. Sarah's grave was simple, a headstone with her name, her dates, and the words, "Beloved, wife, and mother." Buck had added wildflowers in a coffee can, though they were wilted now from the heat. He stood there for a while, hat in his hands, not saying anything. He'd never been much for talking to the dead. He figured if there was anything to say, Sarah already knew it. The sun dropped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Buck walked back down to the house, climbed the porch steps, and settled into his chair, the same chair he'd sat in with Sarah for 37 years. The evening air was cooling, carrying the scent of creosote and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. Buck pulled out his father's pocket watch, opened it, and watched the second hand sweep around the face. Time heals, but honor endures. He wondered about that sometimes. Wondered if his grandfather had really believed it, or if it was just something nice to have engraved on metal. The old man had done things Buck didn't like to think about too much, enforcing boundaries that were never rightfully his, moving people off land they'd lived on for centuries. The history was complicated, written in a language of violence and treaties that weren't worth the paper they were printed on. But that was then. This was now. And Buck had tried to live different. He didn't claim to be a saint, but he tried to be decent. He tried to do right by people. It was all a man could do, really. Put one foot in front of the other, treat people with respect, and hope that when your time came, the scales balanced out somewhere close to even. He sat on that porch until the stars filled the sky, brilliant and countless in the desert darkness. An owl hooted from the barn, hunting. The horses settled into sleep. The land breathed around him, ancient and patient, keeping its secrets. Buck closed his eyes and listened to the silence, feeling the weight of his years, the weight of his memories, the weight of all the things he'd never said and never would. Tomorrow would be another day. Another sunrise, another walk along the fence, another evening on this porch. The ranch would keep demanding from him until he had nothing left to give, and then it would demand more, but that was all right. That was the bargain he'd made a long time ago. This land was his responsibility, his burden, his home. He'd die here, same as Sarah, same as his father, same as his grandfather. Buck stood, his knees protesting, and went inside. He locked the door, something Sarah had always insisted on, and got ready for bed. The house creaked around him, settling into the cool of night. He lay in the darkness, the pocket watch ticking on the nightstand, and thought about nothing in particular until sleep finally came. The next afternoon came hot and still, the kind of day where even the lizards looked for shade. Buck was out on the southern boundary, checking a section of fence near the old wash, where flash floods sometimes took out posts. He'd ridden red despite the horse's arthritis, because the truck couldn't navigate the rocky terrain. The gelding picked his way carefully between creosote bushes and cholla cactus, patient as always. Buck was tightening a wire when he caught movement from the corner of his eye. A figure, dark against the bleached landscape, moving slowly along the base of the hills. He straightened, shading his eyes with his hand. Someone was walking out there, coming from the south, following what might have been an old trail. Even from a distance, Buck could see the person was struggling. He swung up into the saddle and rode toward the figure, Red's hooves crunching on the Kalishi soil. As he got closer, details emerged. An elderly woman, Indigenous, dressed in traditional clothing that had seen better days. She was moving with the careful, measured steps of someone near the end of their strength. Buck could see her lips were cracked, her face drawn with exhaustion. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am," he called out, when he was still 20 feet away. She stopped, turned to face him. Her eyes were dark, intelligent and wary. She had to be 75 at least, maybe older. Her grey hair was pulled back in a bun, and she wore a necklace of turquoise and silver that caught the light. But what struck Buck most was her bearing. Despite her obvious distress, she held herself with a dignity that commanded respect. "You need help, ma'am?" Buck asked. He pulled the canteen from his saddle horn and held it out. "Water?" She hesitated, studying him. Then, slowly, she nodded and stepped forward. Buck dismounted and handed her the canteen. She drank carefully, not gulping, showing the discipline of someone who understood thirst. When she'd had enough, she handed it back. "Thank you," she said in English, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "You walking far?" Buck asked. She gestured vaguely north, toward the mountains. Buck frowned. That was miles of rough country, no real roads, just old trails that most people had forgotten existed. This woman wouldn't make it another mile in this heat, not in her condition. "My place is just over that rise," he said, pointing. "You're welcome to rest there, get out of the sun for a while." She looked at him for a long moment, those dark eyes seeming to measure something deeper than his words. Then she nodded again. Buck helped her up onto Red, climbing up behind her. The horse grunted but took the extra weight without complaint. They rode slowly back toward the ranch, the sun beating down on them like a hammer on an anvil. At the barn, Buck helped the woman down. Up close, he could see more details. Her clothes were dusty from travel, traditional garments with intricate patterns. One of her moccasins was torn, the leather split along the side, and he could see that her foot was blistered underneath. She'd been walking for days, maybe longer. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you somewhere cool." He led her into the barn, where the temperature was at least 15 degrees lower than outside. The horses watched from their stalls with mild curiosity. Buck grabbed an old saddle blanket, shook the dust off it, and spread it over a pile of hay bales. "You can rest here," he said. "I'll bring more water." The woman sank down onto the blanket with visible relief. She closed her eyes for a moment, and Buck could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. He went to the house and filled a pitcher with cold water from the tap, grabbed a clean glass and a towel. In the kitchen, he found the last apple in his fruit bowl, a Granny Smith that was starting to soften, and a half loaf of bread that Maria had sent home with him yesterday. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. Back in the barn, the woman had her torn moccasin off and was examining her foot. The blister was angry and red, probably infected. Buck set down the water and food, then went to his workshop area in the back of the barn. He kept a first aid kit there, along with his leatherworking tools. "Let me see that shoe," he said, gesturing. She handed him the moccasin, and he turned it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was beautiful, the beadwork intricate and precise. It had been made by someone with real skill. The split in the leather could be fixed, though. Buck selected a piece of soft leather from his scrap bin, cut a patch to size, and began stitching it with an awl and heavy thread. His hands moved with practiced ease. He'd repaired plenty of tack over the years, and this wasn't so different. While he worked, the woman ate the apples slowly, drinking water between bites. She tore off pieces of bread and chewed them carefully, as if savoring every morsel. Buck didn't try to make conversation. He figured if she wanted to talk, she would. Besides, he'd never been much for small talk anyway. When he finished repairing the moccasin, he brought it back to her. She examined his work, running her fingers over the stitching, and nodded approvingly. Then she said something in a language Buck didn't understand. It wasn't Spanish, which he knew a little of. This was something older, something that belonged to this land in a way Spanish never had. "Apache?" he asked. She nodded. "Chiricahua." Buck had heard of them. Of course. Everyone in this part of the country knew the history, even if they didn't like to talk about it. The Apache Wars, Geronimo, the forced relocations. His grandfather had been part of that, had served with the cavalry. It wasn't something the family discussed much. "You got far to go still?" he asked. She made a gesture toward the north, toward the mountains. Then she touched her necklace, the turquoise catching the light streaming through the barn's gaps, and said something else in Chiricahua. Buck didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. She had somewhere she needed to be, something she needed to do. "Well, you rest as long as you need," he said. "I'll check on you later. There's more water in that pitcher." He stood to leave, but she reached out and touched his arm. Her hand was small, weathered, the bones prominent beneath thin skin. She looked up at him and spoke in English again. "You are a good man." Buck didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and headed back to the house. He had evening chores to do, horses to feed, his own dinner to make, but his mind kept returning to the woman in his barn. Who was she? Where had she come from? Where was she going? As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Buck checked on her one more time. She was lying on the saddle blanket, eyes closed, breathing steady. She looked peaceful, finally getting the rest she desperately needed. Buck noticed she had one hand on her necklace, holding it like it meant something important. He left her in peace and went back to the house. He made himself a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, ate it while watching the sunset from his porch. The evening was cooling down, a slight breeze stirring the dust in the yard. The horses were settled for the night, their shadows long in the fading light. Buck figured the woman would be gone by morning. She'd rest through the night, wake with the dawn, and continue on her way. That's how these things usually went. People passed through, you helped them if you could, and then they moved on. That was just how life worked out here. He washed his dishes, checked that the doors were locked, and went to bed. Through his window he could see the barn, dark against the starlit sky. Somewhere inside, the woman slept. Buck hoped she'd find whatever she was looking for in those mountains. He hoped the road ahead would be kinder to her than the road behind had been. Sleep came easy that night, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep of a man with a clear conscience. Buck had done what any decent person would do. He'd offered water to someone who was thirsty, food to someone who was hungry, rest to someone who was exhausted. It was simple humanity, the kind of thing that shouldn't need thinking about. He had no way of knowing that this simple act would change everything. Buck woke to the sound that didn't belong. It took him a moment to place it, his mind still foggy with sleep. Not the usual morning birds, not the horses stirring in their stalls. This was something else. Rhythmic, growing, a rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. He sat up, reached for his father's pocket watch. 5:45. The sky outside his window was just beginning to lighten, that deep purple blue of desert dawn. The sound continued, building in volume and complexity. Thunder, maybe. But the sky had been clear last night, and this was the dry season. Buck pulled on his jeans and boots, grabbed a shirt from the chair. He moved through the house quickly, some instinct telling him this wasn't something to take slow. At the front door, he paused long enough to grab the rifle from its place by the coat rack. Not that he thought he'd need it, but a man didn't survive out here by being careless. He stepped onto the porch, and the world stopped. Horses, dozens of them. No, more than dozens. Hundreds. They were emerging from every direction, from behind the hills to the east, from the wash to the south, from the high ground to the west. Riders on horseback, moving with a precision that spoke of coordination and purpose. The morning sun caught on silver bridles, on polished leather, on the movement of muscle and mane. Buck's hands tightened on the rifle, but he didn't raise it. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was seeing. This wasn't an attack. If it were, they'd be moving faster, with aggression. Instead, they were circling, creating a perimeter around his property. Silent, watchful, waiting. He counted automatically, the way he'd count cattle. 50, 75, 100. The numbers kept climbing. Most of the riders wore a mixture of traditional and modern dress jeans and boots, combined with ribbon shirts, some with traditional breechcloths, others in cowboy hats decorated with eagle feathers and beadwork. The horses themselves were magnificent, a mix of paints, Appaloosas and solid colors, all well cared for and obviously trained. 200, 250, 300, maybe more. Buck had never seen anything like it in his life. They completed their circle, and then they stopped. The silence that followed was more profound than any Buck had ever experienced. 300 horses and riders, not a sound among them. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet. The morning held its breath. Movement from the barn caught Buck's eye. The doors swung open, and riders emerged. These ones had apparently been inside, or perhaps they'd approached from the north while Buck's attention was elsewhere. They moved in formation, and in the center of them walked the elderly woman. But she was transformed. Yesterday she'd been exhausted, vulnerable, barely able to stand. Now she moved with authority, her head high, her bearing regal. The torn moccasin had been replaced with new ones, pristine and elaborately beaded. Her clothing, while still traditional, looked fresh, but most striking was the way the warriors around her carried themselves. These weren't escorts. These were guards, honor guards. Buck's mouth went dry. He'd helped a lot of people over the years, but apparently never anyone like this. The woman and her escorts moved forward, stopping about 30 feet from the porch. One of the younger riders dismounted and approached. He was perhaps 40, tall and lean, with long black hair tied back and eyes that missed nothing. He wore jeans, boots, and a turquoise shirt with a silver belt buckle that caught the light. "Mr. Hartley," the man said in perfect English, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "My name is Marcus Whitehorse. I'm here to translate for Grandmother Naisha." Buck looked past Marcus to the elderly woman. She stood straight and still, those dark eyes fixed on him with the same measuring look from yesterday. But now Buck understood there was more to that look. She wasn't just an old woman. She was someone important, someone who commanded this many riders with nothing but her presence. "Ma'am," Buck said, nodding to her. Then to Marcus, "What's all this about?" Marcus smiled, but it was a complicated expression, part warmth, part something Buck couldn't quite read. "Grandmother Nayesh wanted to thank you properly for your kindness yesterday. She also has something she'd like to discuss with you." "Discuss?" Buck's hand had relaxed on the rifle, but he didn't set it down, not with 300 armed riders surrounding his property. "What kind of discussion requires this many people?" "The kind that's been delayed for 5 generations, Marcus said. The elder woman spoke then, in Chiricahua, her voice strong and clear. She spoke for perhaps 30 seconds, her hands moving expressively, her eyes never leaving Buck's face. When she finished, Marcus translated, "Grandmother Naisha says you showed her kindness when you had no reason to. You gave her water from your own canteen, food from your own table, rest in your own barn. You repaired her shoe with your own hands. You asked for nothing in return. You did not ask who she was or where she was going. You simply saw another human being in need, and you helped." Buck shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the praise. "Any decent person would have done the same." "Perhaps," Marcus said, "but decent people are rarer than you might think, and what you may not know, Mr. Hartley, is that yesterday Grandmother Naisha was on a ceremonial journey. She was walking the old boundaries, the traditional lands of our people, paying respects at sacred sites. It's a journey she makes every 5 years, and she insists on doing it the old way, on foot, alone." The elder spoke again, and Marcus continued translating. "She says that in 3 days of walking, she passed through the lands of 7 different ranches. Some did not see her. Some saw her but looked away. Some saw her and shouted for her to leave. Only you stopped. Only you offered help." Buck didn't know what to say to that. The thought of those other ranchers, people he probably knew, turning away from an old woman in the desert heat, made something twist in his gut. "She also wants you to know," Marcus went on, "that she is not just anyone. She is Naisha's great-great-granddaughter. She carries the name and the authority of the great chiefs. Among our people, she is one of the most respected elders. Her word carries weight, her endorsement opens doors, her judgment matters." Buck swallowed hard. Naish, even he knew that name. One of the last great Chiricahua Apache chiefs, one of the last to surrender. A man who'd fought to protect his people's way of life until there was no fight left to give. "I didn't know," Buck said quietly. She knows you didn't know, Marcus replied. That's why it matters. You helped her because it was right, not because of who she was. And that, Mr. Hartley, is exactly the kind of man she was hoping to find. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the yard. The circle of riders remained motionless, patient, waiting. Buck could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on him, could feel the significance of this moment even if he didn't fully understand it yet. "What does she want?" he asked. Grandmother Nisha spoke again, longer this time, her voice taking on a ceremonial quality. When she finished, Marcus took a breath before translating. "She wants to talk about the land, Mr. Hartley. She wants to talk about water. She wants to talk about boundaries drawn in the wrong places and histories that have been buried too long. She wants to talk about making something right that's been wrong for 150 years. Marcus paused. "Are you willing to listen?" Buck looked at the elder woman, at her dignified stance and knowing eyes. He looked at the circle of warriors, at their patient discipline. He looked at his ranch, the land his family had held for 3 generations, and thought about his grandfather's pocket watch, about honor and time and all the things that endured. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'm willing to listen." Marcus gestured toward Buck's porch. "May we?" Buck nodded and set the rifle against the wall, a gesture of trust that didn't go unnoticed. The elder woman moved forward with Marcus and 2 other riders, who stayed a respectful 3 paces behind. Buck noticed one was a woman, perhaps 50, with grey streaking through her black hair, wearing a traditional dress and a leather satchel across her shoulder. The other was an older man, maybe 65, his face deeply lined, wearing a mixture of cowboy and traditional dress, with a ceremonial staff in his hand. They settled on the porch, Grandmother Nish taking Buck's chair without hesitation. He didn't mind. It felt right, somehow. Marcus sat on the porch railing, while the other 2 remained standing. The woman opened her satchel and pulled out what looked like a leather portfolio, old and worn. "This is Sarah Gosiyun," Marcus said, indicating the woman. "She's our tribal historian, and this is Thomas Chihuahua, one of our elders and keeper of oral traditions." Buck nodded to both of them. Thomas returned the nod with grave formality. Sarah smiled slightly, but her eyes were serious. Grandmother Nisha spoke, and Marcus translated. "She wants to begin by explaining something. When the treaties were signed in the 1872 and 1882, much of the land in this region was assigned to settlers through a process that, shall we say, didn't always honor the facts on the ground." Sarah opened the portfolio and pulled out several documents. One was a map, yellowed with age, showing boundary lines that Buck didn't quite recognize. Another appeared to be a treaty, the text small and dense. A third was a series of photographs, old black and white images showing people and places Buck couldn't identify. "This map," Marcus continued as Sarah held it up, "shows the original boundaries as they were understood by our people and as they were recorded in the Treaty of 1873. Notice the spring here." He pointed to a spot on the map. "What you call Devil's Spring. This was always Apache land, sacred ground, a place where ceremonies were held for 1,000 years before Europeans arrived." Buck knew Devil's Spring. It was on the far western corner of his property, almost never visited because the terrain was so rough. He'd been out there maybe half a dozen times in 40 years. "The problem," Marcus went on, "is that when the territorial government issued land grants in 1889, they used a different map, a map that moved the boundaries, put the spring on settler land instead of reservation land." Sarah produced another map, this one more official-looking with stamps and seals. Buck could see what Marcus meant. The boundaries had shifted, maybe by half a mile, but that half mile included the spring. "My grandfather," Buck said slowly. "He was granted this land in 1889. "We know," Marcus replied, "and we're not saying he stole it. We're saying the government's map was wrong, possibly intentionally. The original survey markers were moved. We have testimony from people who watched it happen." Thomas spoke then, in English, his voice deep and resonant. "My grandfather told me. He saw the surveyor, white man named Carson, move the stone markers 3 times, each time moving them west, taking more Apache land, giving it to settlers. Buck felt something cold settle in his stomach. Why didn't anyone say something at the time? They did, Sarah said quietly. My great-grandmother filed a complaint with the territorial authority. So did 6 other families. The complaints were recorded, filed, and ignored. She pulled another document from her portfolio. This is the record. You can see the dates, the signatures, the official stamps, all properly documented, all completely ignored. Grandmother Naish spoke again, longer this time, her hands moving as she talked. Marcus waited for her to finish before translating. She says that this isn't about blame. Your grandfather probably never knew the markers had been moved. Your father certainly didn't. You didn't. But the wrong is still there, written into the land itself. The spring still flows on property that should never have been granted to settlers. And for 5 generations, our people have been unable to access a sacred site, unable to perform ceremonies that connect us to our ancestors. Buck rubbed his face with both hands. The morning sun was getting hot, and he could feel sweat gathering under his collar. What are you asking for? That's the interesting part, Marcus said, and there was something almost like humor in his voice. Grandmother Naish isn't asking you to give up your land. She knows you've worked it your whole life, that your family is buried here. She respects that. Then what? Grandmother Naisha pulled something from her pocket. It was a stone, smooth and dark, about the size of a walnut. She held it out to Buck. He took it carefully, feeling its weight. It was warm from her hand. She spoke, and Marcus translated. This stone comes from Devil's Spring. It's a boundary stone, one of the original markers from before the surveyors came. Thomas's grandfather hid it before Carson could move it, and it's been kept by our people ever since. She's giving it to you as a sign of trust. Buck turned the stone over in his palm. On one side, he could see markings, worn but still visible. Symbols he didn't understand, but that clearly meant something. What she proposes, Marcus continued, is a partnership, a formal recognition that the spring is sacred ground, with guaranteed access for ceremonial purposes. In return, our nation will help with your water situation. We have resources you don't. Engineers, drilling equipment, legal expertise. We can help you sink a new well, deeper and more reliable than what you have now. We can help you fight off Sinclair Agricultural Group, who we know has been pressuring you to sell. Buck looked up sharply. How do you know about Sinclair? Sarah smiled. We know a lot, Mr. Hartley. We keep track of what happens on traditional lands, even when those lands are legally owned by others. Sinclair has been buying up ranches across this region for 5 years. They want to create a massive corporate farming operation. They want your water rights especially. Devil's Spring feeds into the aquifer that supplies 3 counties. If Sinclair gets your land, Marcus added, they'll drain that aquifer dry within a decade. They'll pump water for industrial agriculture, for development, for profit. The spring will run dry, the sacred site will become a corporate facility, and there won't be anything anyone can do about it. Buck looked at the stone in his hand, then at Grandmother Naish. She watched him with those penetrating eyes, patient and knowing. Around them, the circle of 300 warriors waited, silent as the desert stones. You're asking me to trust you, Buck said. No, Marcus replied. She's trusting you. Yesterday, you proved you're the kind of man who'll help someone in need. Today, she's betting that you're also the kind of man who'll help make something right, even when it means admitting your family benefited from something wrong. Thomas spoke again, his voice solemn. The land remembers. The water remembers. Your grandfather's bones rest here, but so do the bones of 10,000 years of our people. We're not asking you to choose between your history and ours. We're asking you to recognize that both histories share this ground. Buck stood and walked to the edge of the porch. The sun was fully up now, the heat building. He could see his horses in the corral, could see the barn where the elder woman had slept last night. Beyond that, the land stretched out in all its harsh beauty. His land, his family's land. But before that, someone else's land. And before that, someone else's. Going back further than he could imagine, he thought about his grandfather's pocket watch. Time heals, but honor endures. Maybe the old man had believed it. Maybe he hadn't. But Buck did. He had to. He turned back to face Grandmother Naish. "All right," he said. "Let's talk details." The negotiations lasted 4 hours. By the time they were done, Buck's kitchen table was covered with maps, documents, and handwritten notes. Marcus had proven to be more than just a translator. He was also a lawyer, trained at the University of Arizona, now working for tribal advocacy. Sarah Goziyun had a mind like a steel trap, recalling dates and details with precision that made Buck's head spin. Thomas Chihuahua spoke less, but when he did, everyone listened. The agreement they hammered out was simpler than Buck had feared. The spring would be designated as a site of shared cultural significance. The tribe would have access 4 times a year for ceremonies, with 2 weeks' notice. In return, they'd fund and oversee the drilling of a new well on Buck's property, guaranteed to hit water at a sustainable depth. They'd also provide legal representation if Sinclair pushed harder to acquire his land. But there was more. Grandmother Naisha, through Marcus, explained that she wanted Buck to understand what the spring meant to her people. She wanted him to witness a ceremony. She wanted him to learn the stories. She wanted this to be more than just a legal arrangement on paper. "If we're going to share this land," Marcus had said, "we need to share the understanding of why it matters." Buck had agreed, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. By noon, the 300 warriors had dispersed as quietly as they'd arrived, fading back into the landscape like morning mist. Only a small group remained: Marcus, Sarah, Thomas, and Grandmother Naisha herself, along with 4 younger people who Marcus introduced as part of the drilling team. Buck made lunch sandwiches and coffee, nothing fancy, and they ate on the porch, talking about logistics. The drilling would start in 3 days. They'd bring in equipment, sink a test bore, and if the surveys were right, they'd hit good water at about 450 feet. The whole operation would take 2 weeks, maybe 3. "You'll have better water than you've ever had," one of the young engineers said. Her name was Rita, and she had a confidence that reminded Buck of his daughter. "The aquifer at that depth is pristine, cold, clean, reliable, even in drought years." After lunch, Marcus and Sarah left to file the necessary paperwork with the county. The drilling team headed back to prepare equipment. That left Thomas and Grandmother Naish, who seemed in no hurry to leave. "She wants to see the spring," Marcus had said before he left. "Thomas can take you both. He knows the path." So Buck found himself on horseback again, Red carrying him steady and slow, while Thomas rode a beautiful paint mare, and Grandmother Naish sat behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist. They followed the western fence line, then cut south into rougher country. The ride took an hour. The land here was different from the eastern portions of the ranch, more broken, more vertical, with exposed rock formations and steep arroyos. Saguaro and ocotillo grew sparse, and the creosote bushes were older, more gnarled. Buck hadn't been out this way in maybe 2 years. Thomas led them to a narrow canyon Buck barely remembered. They had to dismount and lead the horses single file through a passage between 2 rock walls. The air was cooler here, shaded, and Buck could smell water somewhere ahead. The spring emerged from the rock face in a small grotto, maybe 20 feet across. Water trickled from a crack in the stone, fell into a natural basin, then overflowed into a channel that wound away into the earth. The basin was surrounded by smooth rocks, worn by centuries of water and use. Petroglyphs covered the walls, symbols, animals, human figures, geometric patterns. Grandmother Naisha approached the spring slowly, reverently. She knelt by the water, cupped her hands, and drank. Then she touched her wet fingers to her forehead, her lips, her heart. She spoke in Chiricahua, a prayer or blessing, her voice soft but carrying in the enclosed space. Thomas stood beside Buck, watching. My grandfather was born here, he said quietly. Not in this exact spot, but near it. This spring has never run dry, not in 1,000 years. It's why this place is sacred. In the desert, water is life. Permanent water is holy. Buck looked at the petroglyphs, at the worn stones, at the elder woman praying by the water. He tried to imagine 1,000 years of people coming to this place. Births, deaths, ceremonies, prayers, stories told and retold until they became part of the rock itself. My grandfather never came here, Buck said. At least I don't think he did. My father neither. We always knew about the spring, but it was just water to us. Something practical. That's the difference, Thomas replied. To you, it's a resource. To us, it's a relative. We don't own the water. We're related to it. We have responsibilities to it, and it has gifts for us. That relationship is older than any deed or title. They stayed at the spring for an hour. Grandmother Naishe sat on one of the smooth rocks, eyes closed, her hands resting on her knees. Buck sat nearby, feeling oddly uncomfortable in his own property. This place didn't feel like his. It felt like he was a guest, or maybe an intruder. On the ride back, Thomas talked more, telling stories his grandfather had told him. Stories about the spring, about the land, about the people who'd lived here. Buck listened, trying to absorb it all, but it was overwhelming. Every rock had a story, every canyon had a name, every season had ceremonies. The land he'd thought he knew was suddenly revealed as something far deeper and more complex. By the time they returned to the ranch house, the sun was lowering toward evening. Grandmother Naisha dismounted stiffly, her age showing now after the long ride, but she looked satisfied, peaceful. She spoke to Thomas, who nodded and turned to Buck. She says thank you for showing her the way back to the spring. She hadn't been there in many years. She thought she might die before seeing it again. She's welcome any time, Buck said and meant it. She knows. That's why she gave you this. Thomas held out a small leather pouch tied with sinew. She wants you to keep this by the spring. It's corn pollen, blessed and sacred. When you go there, put a pinch in the water as an offering. It's a way of maintaining the relationship. Buck took the pouch carefully. I don't know the prayers. The water doesn't need fancy words, Thomas said. Just respect, just acknowledgement, just the understanding that you're part of something bigger than yourself. That evening, after Thomas and Grandmother Naisha had ridden away, Buck sat on his porch and thought about everything that had happened. 2 days ago, he'd been alone, struggling, watching his ranch slowly die. Today, he had allies, resources, and responsibilities he'd never imagined. He pulled out his father's pocket watch, opened it, watched the second hand sweep around. Time heals, but honor endures. Maybe he was finally beginning to understand what that meant. Not just holding on to old pride, but recognizing old debts. Not just defending what was yours, but acknowledging what never was. He looked out at his land, no, their land, and wondered what his grandfather would think. The old man had been a product of his time, believed what he'd been told, done what he thought was right. But that didn't mean it had been right. And Buck wasn't his grandfather. He had a choice the old man never had, to make things better, instead of keeping them the same. In the distance, a coyote called. The horses answered with soft nickers. The land settled into evening, ancient and patient, waiting to see what would happen next. Word traveled fast in Tres Piedras. By the time Buck drove into town 3 days later, everyone knew about the warriors, the agreement, and what Buck had agreed to. The reactions were mixed, and most of them weren't positive. Hank was waiting at the feed store, arms crossed, his weathered face set in hard lines. "You mind telling me what the hell you're thinking?" Buck had expected this. He set his hat on the counter and met Hank's eyes. "I'm thinking I'm doing what's right." "Right." Hank's voice rose. "Buck, your grandfather fought in the Apache Wars. My grandfather too. They died protecting this land from people who were already here." Buck interrupted quietly. People who'd been here for 1,000 years before any white man showed up. That's not the point. That's exactly the point, Hank. An uneasy silence fell between them. Other customers in the store had stopped what they were doing, watching. Buck recognized most of them, ranchers, farmers, people he'd known his whole life. Their faces showed everything from curiosity to outright hostility. "You know what Sinclair's going to do with this?" Hank finally said. "They're going to use it against all of us. Look, even old Buck Hartley admits the land claims are questionable. They'll use it to break apart property rights across the whole county. Sinclair can go to hell," Buck said. "This has nothing to do with them. Everything has to do with them. They're circling us like vultures, Buck. Every rancher who sells out, every property that changes hands, it makes the rest of us weaker. We need to stand together, not make deals with who?" Buck's voice was steel now. "With our neighbors? With people who've been here longer than we have? With folks who just want access to a sacred site on land that was taken from them illegally? Says who? Some old documents that suddenly appeared? How do you know they're even real?" "Because I looked at them, Hank. Because I saw the original survey markers, saw the testimony, saw the dates. It's all there. The boundary was moved. The land was taken. That's just fact." Hank shook his head. "You're making a mistake. A big one, and you're going to regret it." Buck picked up his hat. "Maybe, but I'd regret the other choice more." He walked out without buying anything. Behind him, he could hear the murmur of voices starting up, people talking about him, about what he'd done. Let them talk. He'd lived through worse. At the diner, Maria was more sympathetic but still worried. She brought him coffee and sat across from him in the booth, something she rarely did during business hours. "People are scared, Buck," she said. "They don't understand what you're doing, and fear makes people say ugly things. I know. Do you? Because there's talk. Jim Henderson is saying you've been brainwashed. Carol Simmons thinks you're senile. And there's worse being said by folks I won't name." Buck sipped his coffee. It was hot and bitter the way he liked it. "What do you think, Maria?" She was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes thoughtful. "I think you saw someone who needed help, and you helped them. I think you learned something about your land that made you want to do the right thing. My abuela used to say that the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land. Maybe you're finally understanding that. Your grandmother was a wise woman." "She was Apache," Maria said softly. "On my mother's side. Did you know that?" Buck looked at her in surprise. He'd known Maria for 30 years and never known that. "I don't talk about it much," she continued. "People in this town have long memories and short compassion. But my great-grandmother was at Fort Apache. She survived the long walk, the reservations, the schools that tried to beat the Indian out of her. She told my abuela stories about the old days, about the land before the fences, about springs and mountains that had names we're not supposed to remember." "Devil's Spring?" Buck asked. Maria smiled. "We call it by another name. But yes, my great-grandmother told stories about that place. About ceremonies there, about children born there, about her own grandmother teaching her to pray by that water." She reached across the table and squeezed Buck's hand. "What you're doing, Buck, letting them return, recognizing what was taken, it matters. It matters more than you know." Buck felt something loosen in his chest, a tightness he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Thank you, Maria. Don't thank me. Just don't let them run you off. And be careful. Sinclair doesn't like things they can't control, and what you're doing, it's unpredictable. That makes you dangerous to them." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a man in an expensive suit walked into the diner. Buck recognized him immediately. James Coulter, one of Sinclair's regional managers. Slick, educated, the kind of man who smiled while he cut your throat. "Mr. Hartley," Coulter said, sliding into the booth without being invited. "I was hoping I'd find you here. Coulter, I hear congratulations are in order. You've entered into quite the interesting arrangement with our Indigenous neighbors. Not your business. Actually, it is my business." Sinclair has significant interests in this region, and anything that affects water rights or property boundaries affects us. We're stakeholders, whether you like it or not. Buck said nothing, just watched the man with steady eyes. Coulter leaned forward, his smile never wavering. I'll be frank with you, Buck. What you've done, it's going to create problems. Legal problems, political problems. The county commissioners are already asking questions. The State Water Board is concerned. You've opened a dected door that a lot of people would prefer stayed closed. Maybe it should have been opened a long time ago. Maybe. But here's the thing, when doors open, sometimes the wrong people walk through them. Environmental regulations, historical preservation laws, Indigenous land claims, water rights litigation. It gets complicated fast. And complicated is expensive. Very expensive. Is that a threat? It's a reality check. Coulter pulled an envelope from his jacket and laid it on the table. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer, triple what we offered before. You'd be set for life, Buck. No more worrying about wells or drought or property taxes. You could retire somewhere nice, spend time with your kids, enjoy your golden years. Buck looked at the envelope, but didn't touch it. I'm not interested. Don't you want to at least look at the number? No. Coulter's smile finally cracked, showing something colder underneath. You're making enemies, Buck. Powerful enemies. People who don't like precedents being set, who don't like the idea of ranchers partnering with tribes, who see what you're doing as a threat to established order. Then I guess I'm a threat. You're an old man with a dying ranch. Don't be a fool. Buck stood up, dropped money on the table for his coffee. I've been a fool before, Coulter. I survived it. But I've never been a coward, and I'm not about to start now. He walked out, leaving Coulter sitting in the booth with his envelope of blood money. Outside, the sun was brutal, the heat radiating off the asphalt in waves. Buck climbed into his truck and sat there for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, steadying himself. His phone rang, an old flip phone that barely got service out here. It was Marcus. Buck, we've got a problem. Sinclair filed an injunction to stop the well drilling. They're claiming it violates county water extraction regulations. We're fighting it, but it might delay everything by weeks. Buck closed his eyes. Of course they did. What do we need to do? Show up at the county hearing next week. Bring documentation. Be prepared to fight. Marcus paused. I'm sorry, Buck. I didn't think they'd move this fast. I did, Buck said. Men like Coulter don't wait around. They strike while you're vulnerable. Are you having second thoughts? Buck looked out at the town, at the people walking past, at the mountains in the distance. No, not even for a second. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. Then I'll see you at the hearing. Buck drove home slowly, thinking about everything that was coming. The fight ahead would be long and ugly. He'd lose friends, make enemies, probably spend money he didn't have on lawyers and legal fees, but somewhere deep in his bones, he knew it was right. Honor wasn't convenient. It wasn't safe, but it endured. The county hearing was scheduled for Tuesday at 10 in the morning. Buck spent Monday preparing, going over documents with Marcus. And Sarah, trying to understand the legal arguments they'd be making. The law was complicated, full of precedents and technicalities that made his head ache. But the fundamental issue was simple. Did Sinclair have the right to block a well on private property when they owned no stake in that property? Monday evening, Buck drove out to Devil's Spring alone. He wanted to see it again, to remember why he was doing this. The ride was familiar now, the path less daunting. He carried the pouch of corn pollen Grandmother Naisha had given him, and when he reached the spring, he did as Thomas had instructed. He pinched a small amount of the pollen and sprinkled it into the water, watching it drift and dissolve. He didn't know the proper prayers, so he just spoke from his heart. I'm trying to do right by this place, by the people who came before. I hope that's enough. The spring burbled and flowed, unchanged, uncaring, eternal. Buck sat there for a while, listening to the water, feeling the coolness of the grotto, looking at the ancient petroglyphs. This place had witnessed thousands of years of human history. His struggles, his decisions, they were just one more moment in an endless chain. He was mounting red to head back when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. An engine, multiple engines, getting closer. Vehicles, from the sound of it, coming from the direction of his ranch house. Buck's jaw tightened. If Sinclair was sending people to harass him on his own property, there'd be hell to pay. He rode back quickly, Red sensing his urgency and moving faster than usual despite his arthritis. As he crested the rise that overlooked his ranch, Buck pulled up short. Trucks, half a dozen of them, parked in his yard. But these weren't Sinclair's corporate vehicles. These were work trucks, some beat up and old, others newer but dusty. And there were people, maybe 20 of them, unloading equipment from the truck beds. Drilling equipment. Buck rode down, confused. Marcus had said the drilling was delayed, stopped by the injunction. What was going on? As he approached, Marcus stepped out from behind one of the trucks, grinning. Surprise! Buck dismounted. I thought we had to wait for the hearing? We do. For the tribal drilling team? Yes. But there's nothing in the injunction about you hiring a private contractor to drill a well on your own land with your own money. I don't have the money for this. No, said a voice Buck knew. He turned to see Doc Martinez walking toward him, wiping his hands on a rag. But I do. And so does Maria, and old Julio, and about 15 other people in Tres Piedras who are tired of watching Sinclair push us around. Buck stared. You all pooled money to drill my well? Call it an investment in standing up to bullies, Doc said. Plus, Maria reminded us that you've helped every person in this town at one time or another. Time we returned the favor. Buck felt his throat tighten. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Maria said, emerging from his house with a cooler. Just let us work. We're burning daylight. The drilling operation was run by a contractor named Miguel Reyes, a short, stocky man with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for finding water in impossible places. He'd already surveyed the site, the eastern pasture, where Marcus and Sarah's geological reports indicated the deepest part of the aquifer, and was ready to start. We work fast, Miguel said. Quiet, too. By the time Sinclair realizes what's happening, we'll be at 400 feet. And they did work fast. The drill rig was set up by nightfall, and they started drilling by lamplight. The sound carried across the desert, a steady, mechanical rhythm. Buck brought out coffee and sandwiches, feeling useless but grateful. People from town kept showing up not to help with the drilling, but to stand witness, to show support, to make it clear that Buck wasn't alone. Hank showed up around midnight, climbed out of his truck, and stood there for a long moment, looking at the operation. Then he walked over to Buck. I was wrong, Hank said simply. What you're doing, it's got more spine than I gave you credit for. More spine than I've shown lately. Buck nodded, accepting the apology. Those tribal folks, Hank continued, they helped set this up, didn't they? Even though the injunction blocked them from doing it directly. Marcus made some calls, Buck admitted. Connected us with Miguel. Said if we were going to fight together, we needed to think creative. Hank smiled. A rare sight. Clever. Real clever. The drilling continued through the night. Buck dozed in his porch chair, waking periodically to the sound of the rig, to the quiet conversations of the workers, to the smell of fresh coffee someone kept brewing. When he woke fully at dawn, they'd already hit 300 feet. Marcus arrived at sunrise with Sarah and Thomas, and to Buck's surprise, grandmother, Nish. The elder woman walked slowly to the drill site, watched for a moment, then nodded approvingly. She spoke in Chiricahua, and Thomas translated, She says this is how it should be. Different people, working together, helping each other. This is the old way, before the boundaries, before the fighting. Just people being good to each other. At 8:30 in the morning, Miguel shouted, Water! We hit water! A cheer went up from the assembled crowd. Buck walked to the rig and looked down into the borehole. Sure enough, water was bubbling up, cold and clear. Miguel tested it, measured the flow rate, and grinned. 20 gallons a minute, easy. Maybe more. You've got yourself a real well, Buck. This'll last you 50 years. Buck shook Miguel's hand, then Doc's, then Maria's, working his way through the crowd. People clapped him on the back, congratulated him, shared in the victory. It was more than just a well. It was proof that community still meant something, that standing together was still possible. But the celebration was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. 2 SUVs, black and official-looking, pulled into the yard. Men in suits climbed out, along with a county sheriff's deputy. Coulter led the group, his face tight with anger. "This is illegal," Coulter snapped. "There's an injunction against well drilling on this property." "Against tribal drilling," Marcus said calmly, stepping forward. "There's no injunction against Mr. Hartley hiring a private contractor to drill on his own land. We'll see about that. Deputy, I want this operation shut down." The deputy, a man named Tom Ramirez, who Buck had known since Tom was in high school, looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Coulter, I'm not sure I have the authority to—" "You have the authority to enforce legal injunctions." "The injunction is specific," Marcus said, pulling out his phone and showing the document. "It names the Tribal Drilling Corporation. It says nothing about private contractors. We checked with 3 different lawyers before we started." Coulter's face went red. "This is sophistry. Legal trickery." "No," Buck said quietly. "This is neighbors helping neighbors. This is people deciding that corporate bullies don't get to push them around anymore. You tried to stop me from getting water on my own land. That tells me everything I need to know about you and Sinclair. You're making a very big mistake, Hartley. I've been told that a lot lately. Hasn't changed my mind yet." Coulter turned to the deputy. "I want all their names. Everyone here. I want to know everyone who participated in this." Grandmother Naisha stepped forward then. She was small, elderly, but her presence was enormous. She spoke in Chiricahua, her voice carrying authority. Marcus didn't translate immediately, but Coulter seemed to understand he was being addressed. When she finished, Marcus spoke. "Grandmother Naisha says you should be careful what you wish for. There are more than 50 people here right now. More than half of them are tribal members. You start a fight with this community, you'll find out what it means when people who've been pushed around for 150 years decide to push back." Coulter looked at the assembled crowd, ranchers and tribal members standing side by side, united. For the first time, Buck saw something like fear flicker across the man's face. "This isn't over," Coulter said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Buck agreed. "It's just beginning." The SUVs left, kicking up dust as they sped away. The deputy apologized quietly to Buck and followed. The crowd remained, and slowly the celebration resumed. Someone brought out a guitar. Someone else started grilling food. What had begun as a practical operation to drill a well transformed into something else, a community gathering, a statement of solidarity, a celebration of resistance. As the sun climbed higher, Buck stood with Marcus, watching people laugh and talk and share food. The week following the well drilling was tense. Buck knew Sinclair wouldn't let things stand as they were, but the attack came from a direction he hadn't anticipated. Not legal action or corporate pressure, but something more personal and far more dangerous. His daughter Emily called on Thursday evening, her voice tight with worry. "Dad, I just got a very strange call from a lawyer. He said he's representing a group of concerned citizens who are worried about your mental competency." Buck's hand tightened on the phone. "What? They're claiming you've been making erratic decisions, entering into agreements you don't fully understand, possibly being manipulated by outside interests. They're suggesting that maybe you need someone to help manage your affairs. Dad, they're talking about a conservatorship evaluation." The bottom fell out of Buck's stomach. This was clever, vicious, and hard to fight. Paint him as senile, as vulnerable, as someone who needed to be protected from his own decisions, and suddenly everything he'd done could be undone. "Who's behind this?" he asked, though he already knew. The lawyer wouldn't say. "But Dad, this is serious. If they file a petition, there'll be hearings, evaluations, maybe even temporary restrictions on your ability to make decisions about the property. I'm fine, Emily. I'm not senile. I'm making choices that some people don't like, but that doesn't mean I'm incompetent. I know that, and I'll help you fight it. But you need to be prepared. They're going to dig into everything, your health records, your finances, your recent activities. They're going to make a case that you're vulnerable and being taken advantage of. After Emily hung up, promising to look into the legal filing, Buck sat in his kitchen trying to process what was happening. This wasn't just about the land anymore. This was about his autonomy, his dignity, his right to make his own choices. He called Marcus, who listened, grimly. I'll be honest with you, Buck. This is a smart play on their part. Hard to defend against, hard to win cleanly. Even if we prove you're completely competent, the question will linger. People will wonder, what do I do? We document everything. We show clear thinking, rational decision-making, consistent judgment. We get statements from people who interact with you regularly. Doc, Martinez, Maria, Hank. We show a pattern of competent behavior, and we prepare for the fight. That evening, Doc Martinez came by and conducted an informal evaluation, memory tests, cognitive assessments, physical coordination checks. Buck passed everything easily, but the experience left him feeling exposed and angry. At 63, he was being tested like a child, having to prove his own mind worked. Friday brought more bad news. Sarah Goziun called with information she'd uncovered. Sinclair had been buying up mineral rights across the county, separate from surface rights. They were planning something bigger than just agricultural operations, possibly fracking, possibly industrial extraction. The aquifer Buck's well tapped into was crucial to their plans, and his partnership with the tribe created a complication they couldn't afford. They see this as existential, Sarah explained. If one rancher can successfully partner with the tribe, recognize original land rights, and maintain sovereignty over resources, it sets a precedent. Other ranchers might follow. The whole corporate strategy falls apart. So they have to destroy me. They have to destroy the example you're setting, make it too costly, too painful, too risky for anyone else to try. Buck sat on his porch that night, the new well pumping steadily in the background, a sound that should have brought him peace, but instead felt like a target on his back. He pulled out his father's pocket watch, held it in his palm, felt its familiar weight. Time heals, but honor endures. He thought about his grandfather, wondered if the old man had ever faced a choice like this. Probably not. His grandfather had lived in simpler times, where right and wrong seemed clearer, where the lines between us and them were firmly drawn. But maybe that simplicity had been an illusion. Maybe every generation faced the same choice, just dressed up in different circumstances. Do you do what's easy or what's right? Saturday morning, Grandmother Naisha returned with a larger group, maybe 40 people, including several elders Buck hadn't met. Thomas explained that they were here for a ceremony, a blessing of the new well, a formal recognition of the partnership. It's important, Thomas said. Not just spiritually, but politically. When we bless something, when we claim it as part of our relationship, it becomes harder to destroy. There's power in ritual, in witnessed ceremony. They gathered around the well Buck's neighbors from town, tribal members, even a few ranchers who'd been skeptical but were starting to come around. Grandmother Naisha led the ceremony, speaking in Chiricahua, burning sage and sweet grass, offering corn pollen to the 4 directions. Other elders sang, their voices rising and falling in patterns that seemed to echo off the desert hills. Buck didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling, sacredness, connection. The recognition that this water, this land, this moment, they all meant something beyond dollars and deeds and legal documents. When the ceremony concluded, people stayed. They talked, shared food, told stories. Buck found himself in conversation with elders, hearing tales about the land that went back generations. One old man, whose name was Joseph, told Buck about a white rancher from the 1922nd who'd married an Apache woman, who'd learned to see the land through both sets of eyes. He was hated by both sides at first, Joseph said. White ranchers called him a traitor. Some of our people called him a spy, but he kept doing what he thought was right. By the time he died, both communities respected him. Took 40 years, but it happened. I don't have 40 years, Buck said with a slight smile. No, Joseph agreed, but you have right now. That's all any of us get. Sunday evening, Marcus called with urgent news. The conservatorship petition is being filed Monday morning. But there's something else. Coulter contacted me. He wants to meet. Just you and him. Neutral ground. Says Sinclair has a final offer. I'm not interested. Buck, I think you should take the meeting. Not because I think you should accept whatever they're offering, but because you need to understand what we're up against. Know your enemy. Buck agreed reluctantly. They arranged to meet at a cafe in the next town over, neutral territory, Tuesday morning before the conservatorship hearing. That night, Buck couldn't sleep. He walked his property in the darkness, visiting the corrals where his horses dozed, the barn where the elder woman had rested, the rise where Sarah was buried. The new well hummed steadily, pumping water from deep in the earth, reliable and strong. He thought about everything that had happened in just 2 weeks. How helping one exhausted old woman had led to all of this: partnerships and conflicts, ceremonies and legal battles, community solidarity and corporate revenge. It felt like standing at the center of something much larger than himself, currents of history and justice and greed all swirling together. At the spring, Buck sprinkled more corn pollen into the water and spoke quietly to the darkness. I could use some help here. I'm doing my best, but I'm just one man, an old man at that. I don't know if I'm strong enough for what's coming. The water burbled and flowed, offering no answers, no reassurance, just the steady persistence of its ancient course. Walking back, Buck saw lights on the road, vehicles approaching. His hand went to his hip, where his pistol usually sat, but he'd left it in the house. The vehicles turned into his drive. 3 trucks, tribal plates. Buck relaxed slightly. Marcus climbed out, along with Sarah and half a dozen others. Couldn't sleep, Marcus said. Figured you couldn't either. Thought maybe we should talk strategy. They gathered in Buck's kitchen, spreading documents across the table, legal filings, historical records, witness statements. Sarah had compiled an impressive case showing Buck's clear judgment over the past months. Careful decision-making, thorough research, consistent values. Marcus had statements from Doc Martinez, Maria, Hank, and a dozen others attesting to Buck's mental acuity. The conservatorship petition is weak, Marcus said, but weak cases can still do damage. The key is showing not just that you're competent, but that the petition itself is harassment, is being used as a weapon by corporate interests to override your legal rights. Can we prove Sinclair's behind it? Not directly. They're smart enough to use intermediaries, but we can show the pattern, the timing, the motivation. Any reasonable judge will see what's happening. They worked until nearly dawn, preparing, anticipating arguments, building defenses. By the time the sun rose, Buck felt as ready as he could be. Not confident exactly, but clear about what he stood for and why. As Marcus and the others prepared to leave, Sarah pulled Buck aside. You know what you're doing goes beyond this specific case, right? You're showing that it's possible to bridge divides, to acknowledge historic wrongs while building something new. Win or lose tomorrow, that matters. I'd rather win, Buck said with a tired smile. We all would. But even if we don't, we've already changed something. People are watching. Other ranchers, other communities, other elders. They're seeing that partnership is possible. That's worth fighting for. Buck watched the trucks drive away as full morning arrived. He had a few hours before he needed to leave for the meeting with Coulter, then the hearing after that. He used the time to shower, shave, put on his good shirt and clean jeans. His Sunday clothes, Sarah used to call them. He stood in front of the mirror, studying his reflection. An old man, weathered and worn, but with clear eyes and steady hands. Whatever else happened, he'd know. He'd tried. He'd stood up when it would have been easier to sit down. He'd chosen honor over convenience. His father's pocket watch sat on the dresser. Buck picked it up, slipped it into his pocket, felt its reassuring weight. Time heals, but honor endures. All right, he said to his reflection, let's go endure. The cafe was nearly empty at 9 in the morning, just a few locals drinking coffee and reading newspapers. Coulter sat in a back booth, 2 folders on the table in front of him. He stood when Buck approached, offered his hand. Buck didn't take it. Let's make this quick, Buck said, sliding into the booth. I've got a hearing to get to. About that. Coulter pushed one of the folders across the table. This is everything you need to make the conservatorship petition go away. A statement from our medical consultant declaring you fully competent, a withdrawal of all complaints, and a formal apology from the concerned citizens group. Buck didn't open the folder. In exchange for what? Your signature on this. Coulter tapped the second folder. A standard land sale agreement. Sinclair buys your property at 5 times its appraised value. You walk away wealthy, your reputation intact, free to live wherever you want. And the partnership with the tribe dissolved as part of the sale. The land reverts to standard private ownership under Sinclair's control. The well remains, but access to the spring becomes subject to our discretion and approval. Buck leaned back in the booth, studying Coulter's face. You really think I'm going to agree to this? I think you're a practical man. You've made your point, Buck. You've shown you have principles. Now it's time to be realistic. If you fight us, we'll win eventually. We have more lawyers, more money, more patience. The conservatorship petition is just the beginning. We can make your life hell in 1,000 different ways. I'm sure you can, but it doesn't have to be that way. Take the deal. Set yourself up for a comfortable retirement. The tribe will move on. Find other battles to fight. Your neighbors will remember you as the man who stood up to corporate interests and got a fair shake. Everyone wins. Buck pulled out his father's pocket watch, opened it, looked at the inscription. Time heals, but honor endures. He closed it with a decisive snap. No. Coulter's professional smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. That's your final answer? It is. Then you're a fool, and what happens next is on you. Buck stood. I've been called worse by better men. He walked out of the cafe, into the bright morning sun. His truck was parked across the street, and as he approached it, he saw Marcus leaning against the hood, arms crossed. How'd it go? Marcus asked. About like I expected. Big offer, big threats, same old story. You turned it down? Of course I turned it down. Marcus smiled. Good, because we've got something to show you before the hearing. They drove in convoy Buck's truck, following Marcus's SUV to the county courthouse. The parking lot was packed, far more crowded than Buck had expected for a simple conservatorship hearing. As he climbed out, he understood why. People, dozens of them, tribal members, ranchers, townspeople from Tres Piedras. They lined the walkway to the courthouse entrance, silent and standing witness. Buck recognized faces: Maria from the diner, Doc Martinez, Hank, old Julio with his dog, Miguel who drilled the well. Mixed among them were tribal members, young and old, traditional dress and modern clothing. Grandmother Naisha stood at the front, her presence transforming the crowd from a gathering into a statement. They're here for you, Marcus said quietly. Every one of them is prepared to testify about your character, your judgment, your competence. We put the word out last night. This is what showed up. Buck felt his throat tighten. He walked slowly up the path, nodding to people as he passed. Some reached out to touch his shoulder or shake his hand. No one spoke, but the message was clear. You're not alone. Inside the courthouse, the hallway was equally packed. The hearing was scheduled for courtroom 3, and when they entered, every seat was filled. The judge, a woman named Sandra Martinez, no relation to Doc, looked at the crowd with raised eyebrows. This is quite the turnout for a preliminary conservatorship hearing, she observed. The lawyer representing the petitioners, a slick young man named Bradford, stood. Your Honor, This is clearly an attempt at intimidation, filling the courtroom with supporters to influence. Counsel, I've been on this bench for 20 years. I know intimidation when I see it, and citizens exercising their right to observe legal proceedings, isn't it? Everyone sit down and be quiet, or I'll clear the room. The hearing began, with Bradford presenting the petition. His arguments were smooth and rehearsed. Buck's age, his recent unusual behavior, questions about whether he truly understood the implications of his decisions. He called a witness, a psychologist who'd never met Buck, but who testified about age-related cognitive decline and vulnerability to manipulation. Then, it was Marcus's turn. He called Doc Martinez first, who testified about Buck's recent physical and mental evaluation, which showed no signs of impairment. Then Maria, who talked about Buck's regular visits to town, his clear conversations, his obviously sound judgment. Hank testified about Buck's careful management of his ranch over decades, his reputation for fair dealing, his measured approach to decisions. One by one, witnesses painted a picture of a man who was thoughtful, deliberate, and completely in control of his faculties. Finally, Marcus called Buck himself. Buck walked to the witness stand, was sworn in, and sat down. Judge Martinez looked at him directly. "Mr. Hartley, I'm going to ask you some questions. Answer them honestly and clearly." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you understand the nature of the agreement you've entered into with the tribal nation?" "I do. I'm recognizing their historical claim to a sacred site on my property and granting ceremonial access in exchange for assistance with water infrastructure and legal support. And you believe this is a fair and reasonable agreement?" Buck met her eyes steadily. "I believe it's the right thing to do, Your Honor. The land was taken wrongly. I have a chance to acknowledge that and make something better happen. That's not confusion or manipulation. That's conscience." Judge Martinez made a few notes, then looked at Bradford. "Counsel, do you have questions for Mr. Hartley?" Bradford stood, adjusting his tie. "Mr. Hartley, isn't it true that before this elderly woman appeared on your property, you had no relationship with the tribal nation?" "That's true. And isn't it also true that within days of meeting her, you entered into a complex legal agreement affecting your property rights?" "It wasn't days. It was nearly 2 weeks of discussion, reviewing documents, consulting with my own people. But you admit the timeline was quite rapid?" "The timeline was appropriate for the circumstances." Bradford smiled, thinking he'd scored a point. "Mr. Hartley, how much research did you personally do into the historical claims before agreeing to this arrangement?" "I examined the original survey maps, read witness testimonies, consulted with historians, and verified the documentary evidence. I also trusted people who'd spent their entire lives studying this history." "So you relied on others' expertise?" "That's what reasonable people do, counsel. When I need a doctor, I listen to a doctor. When I need a historian, I listen to a historian." A ripple of quiet laughter went through the courtroom. Judge Martinez's lips twitched, though she maintained her professional demeanor. Bradford tried a different approach. "Isn't it true, Mr. Hartley, that you're currently facing financial difficulties? That your ranch has been struggling? Most ranches in this region are struggling. That's not news. And wouldn't it be fair to say that the resources being offered by the tribal nation assistance with your water situation, legal support came at a time when you were particularly vulnerable?" Buck leaned forward slightly. "Counsel, I've been vulnerable my whole life. This ranch has been struggling since my grandfather first broke ground. Vulnerability doesn't equal incompetence. Sometimes it just means you're honest." "About needing help," Bradford pressed on. "But doesn't that make you susceptible to undue influence? Isn't it possible that—" Marcus stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is speculating and insulting both Mr. Hartley and the tribal representatives present." "Sustained," Judge Martinez said. "Mr. Bradford, get to a point or sit down." Bradford glanced at his notes, clearly frustrated. "No further questions," Marcus stood for redirect. "Buck, one question. If Sinclair Agricultural offered you 10 times what your property is worth, would you sell? No. Why not? Because some things aren't for sale. This land has history that goes deeper than my ownership. I'm just taking care of it for a while, trying to do right by all the people who've been connected to it. That's not something you can buy. Marcus sat down. Judge Martinez looked at Bradford. Any other witnesses? No, Your Honor. Then I'm ready to rule. She looked directly at Buck. Mr. Hartley, I've reviewed the petition, heard the testimony, and observed your demeanor. I find no evidence whatsoever of diminished capacity. You're clearly articulate, thoughtful, and capable of managing your own affairs. The petition for conservatorship is denied. Relief flooded through Buck, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm troubled by the circumstances of this filing. The petition appears to have been initiated shortly after Mr. Hartley made decisions that certain corporate interests disagreed with. While I cannot prove coordination, the timing is suspicious. I'm ordering the petitioners to pay Mr. Hartley's legal costs and warning that any future frivolous filings will be met with sanctions. She banged her gavel. We're adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Not in cheers, this was still a courthouse, but in movement, in energy, in relief. People swarmed Buck, shaking his hand, clapping his back. Grandmother Naish approached slowly, dignified as always, and placed both hands on Buck's shoulders. She spoke in Chiricahua, and Thomas translated. She says you have proven yourself, not just today, but in every moment since you offered her water. She says the ancestors are watching, and they are pleased. Buck didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded respectfully. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown. News had spread, and people were celebrating openly now. Marcus grabbed Buck's arm. This is bigger than the hearing, Buck. Look, he pointed to the edge of the crowd, where several other ranchers stood, men Buck knew by reputation, but had never been friendly with. They were watching, talking among themselves, clearly interested. One of them, a man named Chen, who owned property to the north, approached. Hartley, Chen said, I'd like to talk to you sometime about how this partnership thing works. I've got a similar situation with a spring on my land, tribal members who've been asking for access. Happy to talk, Buck said. 2 more ranchers approached with similar questions. By the time Buck made it to his truck, he'd had conversations with 6 property owners who were reconsidering their relationships with the tribes, with the land, with the corporate interests that had been circling them all. Marcus stood beside him, watching it happen. You know what this is, don't you? This is the precedent they were afraid of. One man doing the right thing, showing others it's possible. That's what Sinclair tried so hard to prevent. Buck climbed into his truck, exhausted but satisfied. They failed. They did. And Buck, Marcus smiled. This is just the beginning. Buck drove home with a convoy of vehicles following friends, allies, people who wanted to celebrate. But as he crested the rise that looked down on his ranch, he asked them all to stop for a moment. There it was, his land, the same as always but different now. The new well pumping steady. The barn where an elder had rested. The spring flowing in its ancient course. And beyond all of it, the desert stretching to the mountains, beautiful and harsh, and forever. This was worth fighting for, all of it. Not just his piece of it, but the whole complicated, painful, hopeful story of people trying to live together on land that belonged to all of them and none of them at the same time. Buck took a deep breath of the desert air and drove down to meet his future. 6 months later, Buck stood at Devil's Spring with a group of 30 people, ranchers, tribal members, county officials, and several reporters from regional papers. It was the spring ceremony, now formally scheduled and recognized. Grandmother Naisha led the ritual, her voice strong despite the cold November air. The spring looked different now. Not physically, the water still flowed from the same crack in the rock, the petroglyphs still marked the walls. But there was a sign now, carved from local wood by one of the tribal craftsmen, Sacred Spring Shared Heritage Site. Below it, in smaller letters, protected by the Hartley Apache Partnership. The name had stuck, even though Buck had tried to keep his own name out of it. Marcus had insisted. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not. Your name means something. It means a white rancher chose conscience over convenience. That matters. 3 other ranchers had followed Buck's example, entering into similar partnerships. Chen, to the north, had granted ceremonial access to a burial site on his property. The Rodriguez family, to the east, had worked out a shared water management plan. Old Sam Patterson, whose grandfather had fought in the Apache Wars same as Buck's, had publicly acknowledged the wrong done and returned several sacred artifacts his family had kept for generations. Sinclair Agricultural Group had pulled out of the region entirely, their plans for massive development scuttled by the new coalitions between ranchers and tribes. Coulter had been reassigned to another region. The last Buck heard, several state legislators were drafting new laws to protect sacred sites and recognize historical land claims, but the changes went deeper than legal victories. Buck's ranch was thriving now. The new well provided more water than he'd ever had, and the tribal engineers had shown him better irrigation techniques. His hay crop had been the best in 20 years. The horses looked healthier. Even the land itself seemed more alive, as if recognizing that it was finally being cared for by people who understood its full history. After the ceremony concluded, people stayed to share food and conversation. Buck found himself talking with Joseph, the elder who'd told him about the rancher from the 1922 who'd married an Apache woman. "You remember what I told you?" Joseph asked. "About how it took 40 years for him to earn respect from both communities." "I remember. You did it in 6 months. Times change, I guess. Or maybe you just showed people what was possible. Faster than he did." Buck shook his head. "I just offered water to someone who was thirsty. Everything else followed from that." "That's exactly my point," Joseph said with a knowing smile. "The biggest changes start with the smallest kindnesses." Emily had driven down from Phoenix with her husband, bringing Buck's 2 grandchildren, kids he rarely saw, but who were wide-eyed at the ceremony, fascinated by the songs and stories. His son, Michael, had called from Colorado, said he might visit for Christmas. The distance between Buck and his children hadn't disappeared, but it had narrowed. They saw him differently now, understood him better, or maybe he understood himself better, and that made everything else easier. Maria had expanded her diner, added a section that served traditional Apache dishes alongside her regular menu. She'd hired 2 tribal members to help cook, and the place was busier than ever. Tourists were starting to come, wanting to see the region where the partnership had happened, where old wounds were being healed. Doc Martinez had started an oral history project, recording stories from both tribal elders and old ranchers, creating a shared archive of the region's complicated past. Hank was helping, despite his initial resistance. The feed store had become an unofficial meeting place where people from different communities could talk, trade, and build relationships. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, Buck found himself alone at the spring for a moment. He pulled out the pouch of corn pollen, now worn from 6 months of use, and sprinkled a pinch into the water. He'd learned a proper prayer from Thomas, but he still preferred his own words. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the water, for the wisdom, for the chance to do better than the generations before me. Help me stay worthy of this trust." Grandmother Nish appeared beside him, moving quietly despite her age. She'd been doing that, lately appearing when Buck needed guidance, as if she could sense his moments of doubt or reflection. She spoke in Chiricahua, and though Buck had been learning the language, he still needed help with complex thoughts. But these words he understood. "You have done well." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the water flow. Buck thought about his grandfather, wondered what the old man would think of all this. Would he be angry, disappointed, or might he in some way understand? The pocket watch was in Buck's pocket now, where he carried it every day. Time heals, but honor endures. Maybe his grandfather had known that truth better than Buck gave him credit for. As darkness settled over the desert, the group began the walk back to the vehicles. Buck took one last look at the spring, at the ancient petroglyphs, at the sign marking this as a shared space. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were still ranchers who opposed what he'd done, still corporate interests looking for ways back in, still complications and conflicts to navigate. But tonight, there was just this. Water flowing where it had always flowed, people from different histories standing together, and the desert holding them all in its patient, eternal embrace. Buck had lived 63 years before understanding that his land was more than dirt and deed. It was story and spirit, history and hope, belonging and responsibility, all tangled together. He'd spent his life taking care of this ranch, but only now understood that the ranch, the land itself, had been taking care of him too, teaching him, challenging him, waiting for him to finally see what had been there all along. The last light faded from the sky, and stars began to appear, brilliant in the clear desert air. Buck walked back to his truck with the others, his heart full, his conscience clear, knowing that tomorrow he'd wake up and do the work again. The fences would still need mending, the horses would be used, still need feeding, and the land would still demand everything he had to give. But now he understood why it was worth it, all of it. Every struggle, every choice, every moment of doubt, because some things mattered more than convenience, more than profit, more than even family legacy. Doing right by the land, by its history, by all the people who'd called it home, that was the real inheritance, the real honor. That was what endured. Buck climbed into his truck and headed home, the desert stretching out around him in the darkness, ancient and beautiful, and finally, truly shared.